Thank you. A very warm welcome to all the government representatives who are with us today, partners, UNICEF, child protection colleagues, and other colleagues working for the UNICEF offices, and CSO partners that have managed to join us today and who are working on care reform in the region and beyond. Before we start, just a quick run through the webinar rules. You're all encouraged, if you haven't done so already, to introduce yourself in the chat box by typing in your name, your job title, and the country office you're working for. I would also like, we will also administer a poll towards the end of the webinar to kind of get to know where everybody is connecting from. This is important to us to inform the participation across the region and beyond. You're all requested to mute your microphone during the session. And just to remind you that we will take all questions will be addressed towards the end of the presentations that have been prepared today. You're encouraged to type in the chat box any questions or comments that you may have, and we'll ensure to respond to them when the Q&A session opens up. You may also use the raise hand button or icon if you want to ask your question directly during the Q&A session. And as I mentioned earlier, this webinar is recorded and will be shared after this session for your reference. All the slides that are going to be presented today will be shared with you in a Google Drive folder that will be pasted in the chat box. So just a quick introduction of the learning platform for those who have, if it's your first time to attend the learning platform. So the regional learning platform on care was established by UNICEF, SRO, in collaboration with Changing the Way We Care. And the purpose of this platform is to share learning across the Eastern and Southern Africa region. The management of the platform is supported by a consultancy firm called Child Frontiers, and we have Emily Dillard, Bertha, and other consultants who are working on this call. And as I mentioned, the learning platform on care reform provides an opportunity for government, UNICEF, and CSOs in our region in East and Southern Africa to share learning on care. We started this platform back in October 2020. We're currently in phase 3 of the learning platform that started this February, and it will run up to September of this year. The operationalization of the phase 3 platform was made possible with funding from USAID, Displaced Children and Orphans Fund through UNICEF SRO. So we're very grateful for support. The learning needs of these platforms are met through webinars. We also have small group exchanges, practitioner videos are produced, and also documentation of case studies and policy briefs are developed and shared for more information. We also have something that we call a help desk, which is basically an email, my email or Emily's email. You can write to us with any question that you have on childcare reform, and we'll do our best to provide the appropriate response in a timely manner. So make sure that you take advantage of that opportunity to ask any question on care that you may have. And we also have a monthly newsletter that is developed and shared on a monthly basis with the updates of what's happening in this platform. The webinar today, as you all know, is on climate change and care reform. And without further ado, I'd like to now pass the floor to Emily of Child Frontiers to introduce the webinar and the speakers. Over to you, Emily.
Thanks. Thanks so much, Mona. So today what we're going to do is Mark Overmans, who is a climate change specialist within UNICEF's regional office for Eastern and Southern Africa, is going to give us a short presentation to start with about the impacts of climate change in the Eastern and Southern Africa region in particular. So we have that bit of context about the effects of climate change on children, families and communities. I have been researching and writing a publication on climate change and care for the regional learning platform. So I'm going to present the findings from that research and explain how care is affected by climate change, how it affects family separation, and how it affects violence within families, and then think about how we need to incorporate climate change and resilience to climate change within our care reform processes, and also within some of the plans around adapting to climate change. And at the end of the presentation, Desi has joined us from the regional office, Sofala regional office of UNICEF Mozambique. And she's going to talk about the impacts of one climate change related emergency, which was Cyclone Idai. And Mark will explain a bit, I think, about how cyclones are being affected by climate change, and explain how that affected children's care, what impacts it had on family separation and violence within families, and how UNICEF and others were able to respond to that particular emergency. So wonderful. I'll hand over to Mark now, and I'll just share my screen again, Mark, so we can see your presentation.
Good morning, everyone.
Sorry, it's being a little bit slow to come up. Let me try that again. Ah, is that working now? Yeah.
Don't see. Yeah, it's coming up.
Okay.
Put it in
fantastic.
presentation mode. Then
I'll put it into presentation mode. Yeah.
And I can let you know when the slide can be changed.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, good morning, everyone, and happy World Water Day. Today is World Water Day celebration, basically to raise attention to the lack of water access for many communities in the world. So I'll talk a little bit about that because it's important for any adaptation measures. And I just maybe would like to talk about climate change in Eastern and Southern Africa. But I also note that day before yesterday, there was a global release of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and their assessment report. So a lot of the details have been confirmed in yesterday's release of what I'm going to talk about. So maybe on the climate change in Eastern and Southern Africa, this crisis is really a child rights crisis. And you can see that a lot of studies have been done in the region, but also globally. And there's more attention to the impacts on children than ever before. So the first report maybe to highlight is the climate crisis report that was done for sub-Saharan Africa. And it highlighted indeed the impacts of children in the countries in the Eastern and Southern Africa region. Secondly, there's also a study done on the impacts of children with the Children's Climate Risk Index to really identify where are these children living, what are the impacts, and how actually can we actually mitigate these things. And then thirdly, there's a global report out that's called Children Living in a Livable Planet. And that's really an action plan also for UNICEF to take action on climate change for children. So all those reports are available online, and they actually can be downloaded, I think, on the UNICEF websites. If you go to the next slide, I can talk a little bit about the impacts of climate change from the field and experiences. For instance, you can see that in Madagascar, the impacts of floods, droughts, and cyclones is having an impact on water availability. And of course, these are mainly bearing a brunt on the most vulnerable households. In this case, it's Vanya, who has been born blind, and she's actually helping out with water carting or water collection from rivers to really help out with the households. And because of this impact of cyclones, floods, and droughts, her life is made much more difficult. And she's helping her stepmother with actually the household chores. Another example is from Mozambique. If you go to the next slide, and here you can see Lisa, and she was born with a physical disability and was also orphaned, but she actually lost also her house when Cyclone Idai tore down indeed the community in 2019 in Mozambique. I've been living in Zimbabwe. We had similar impacts on the eastern side of Zimbabwe bordering Mozambique, and you could see indeed the wide-scale destruction, but also the kind of impact it has on the most vulnerable parts of society. The people that indeed don't have access to resources, the kind of children that are indeed in female-headed households, or even children-led households. So that's really something that has been very much demonstrated by these extreme events like Cyclone Idai. If you go to the next slide, you can see something of the projections of the changes of the climate. As I mentioned, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released their reports, and they identified different scenarios of emissions. And the emissions that are going into the atmosphere and actually causing the global warming, they have different scenarios from a very high emission rate to middle and low emission rates. There's actually a confirmation of these projections. There's actually a small bandwidth between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees, in which actually we will see severe impacts of climate change on the lives of children. If we go above 2 degrees Celsius and above the Paris Agreement targets, which seems to be a likely scenario, we get actually in a territory that has huge ramifications for Africa. So if we actually now are between 1 and 1.5 degrees at the moment, we actually closer to 1.5 degrees than actually here in this slide. We actually already see severe impacts on the livelihoods of children in Africa. So if there's indeed very stringent measures taken to reduce emissions by 2100, we can still maybe reach that kind of bandwidth below 2 degrees, but it's likely that also that is not being achieved if we go actually on the current pathways. So it's important to reduce emissions, because every centigrade reduction of climate change and global warming will actually help to mitigate these impacts. So really the focus on mitigation is being to the attention of many global leaders. The attention to adaptation is actually less in focus. And certainly for children's rights, this is really something that's only been coming to the fore in the last few years. Let's maybe go to the next slide, where you can see some projections for Africa. And then it's actually divided between Southern Africa and Eastern Africa. And on the left-hand side, you can see the kind of graphics of the implications of these climate change scenarios on the temperature on the left side, and also on the rainfall itself on the right side. And you can see the different scenarios. They have actually a scenario that is called RPC, that stands for Representative Concentration Pathway. So if the concentrations will actually go as business as usual, that's actually the scenario that is identified as RCP 8.5. So that's in the kind of orange color. The other scenario is actually if we can reduce emissions from 2020 to the targets we promised to, and actually to zero emissions in 2100. That's going to be a tough kind of case, but you can see that indeed that blue line, that's actually that scenario which is called the peak scenario, that actually is already identifying a much higher kind of impact on temperature as well as on the rainfall itself. So in general, there's going to be a warming trend. It will be hotter in both areas, but actually the rainfall will actually be changing from the Eastern Africa, where there will be a higher rainfall, but a much higher variability within that. In Southern Africa, you see also the rainfall, just variability being increasing, but the overall kind of rainfall that falls in these countries are decreasing. So you can see, if you go back to that slide, you can see that actually can have an impact. For instance, in South Africa, where we had day zero, in Cape Town, where there was simply no water available. You can also remind maybe the droughts in Malawi and in Zimbabwe and Namibia, that also were indeed the impacts of climate change now. On the Eastern Africa side, of course, we have this higher rainfall that you can see during peaks, and that means indeed storms and depressions and cyclones that are impacting. And we saw these examples already in Mozambique and in Madagascar from the two examples in the first slide. So you can see that a bit of a difference in impacts. Also in the color-coded charts, you can see that. And if we go above 4 degrees Celsius in the red slides in the middle, you can see that the southern region is really heavily impacted with heat extremes and heat waves. But also on the rainfall side, it will be maybe much wetter in some areas, but not really all the time. So you can still get drought in a wetter kind of scenario, as we see basically in the Horn of Africa. And then lastly, there's also an increase in climate extreme events. I mentioned the drought already, but also in the occurrence of severe cyclones. There's not a lot of kind of evidence on how many cyclones will be formed and the number and how that's going to change. But what is clear is that actually, because the ocean is hotter and the atmosphere is hotter, that these cyclones will be more severe, they'll be longer lasting, and they'll also be actually more hitting countries inland. And we could see that, for instance, in Zimbabwe, that occasionally gets cyclones, but Cyclone Idai was really an unprecedented occurrence. There's also the last cyclone, Cyclone Freddy. This has been originating in Australia just 40 days ago, and it's still ongoing, as I believe the latest messages have been. And it bounced in between Madagascar, then Mozambique, Zimbabwe, then back to Madagascar, and moved all the way up to Malawi, causing 200 deaths. So this is kind of extremes that have never been shown before. So actually that's going to be expected to be worse. And we already still may be on a pathway that is actually between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees global warming. So we can expect some really severe impacts over time. Now, if we go to the next slide, you can see indeed what kind of impacts it can have on children. I mentioned World Water Day today. We, of course, have already challenges with access to water, for instance, in schools, in healthcare facilities, and in communities. But that water access will be more compromised if there's more variability, and if there are indeed cyclones and storms and landslides that are actually impacting on the infrastructure itself. So as actually water becomes scarcer in some areas, either due to too much, like a flood, or too little during a drought, then children feel really the kind of impact. We can see large-scale outbreaks now of cholera in actually the Southern Africa region. And that's indeed going to change indeed how we can actually provide safe water access to children in communities. Also actually provide them with sanitation facilities that is linked to malnutrition, or actually the diarrhea, that's actually the impact of drinking polluted water. If you have either groundwater that's polluted or surface water that's compromised from surface water runoff. Now you can also see that that can have an impact on education, because water is not only used for water in domestic uses, but also for agriculture and for food production. So food productivity is actually compromised. It also impacts on children that have to maybe care for the household, maybe helping doing chores with water carting, but also maybe directing the attention of schooling to actually helping out with agriculture and bringing indeed crops to the table. So of course we mentioned the cyclones and we mentioned the droughts. If you have a cyclone, it can destroy the school facilities and the infrastructure. If you have a drought, sometimes there's no water at the school, the toilets can't be functioning, and the school has to be closed. So these are other impacts. And of course, if children get sick with diarrhea, they miss indeed important schooling days. So this can have ramifications for the education sector as a whole. If we then go to health and well-being in the blue square, you can see that 2/3 of preventable illnesses from environmental hazards is being experienced by children. And of course, if we talk about diarrhea and stunting, malnutrition, it's really impacting those aged under 5 years. So you can see that this kind of impact from a lack of water access, but also a lack of services, can actually have a huge impact on health and well-being, and it can have a longer lasting kind of impact as well. We know all about the kind of impacts of malnutrition on the health and well-being of children in later ages. And then lastly, there's inequalities. We saw from the examples I showed from Mozambique and Madagascar that those households that indeed are most vulnerable, they're actually more exposed because they're living in marginal areas, but they're also actually getting much more impacts and longer term effects of climate change. So that's actually something of a concern, because inequalities have been rising and climate change will exacerbate that. So maybe I can go to the next slide. And that's, I think, about the climate crisis seen as a child right crisis. UNICEF undertook to actually study some of these hazards, as I mentioned, the floods, the droughts, the heat waves, the lack of water access, etc. If you go to the next slide, you can see those vulnerabilities being also combined with actually the exposure and the vulnerabilities of communities. So UNICEF developed this climate change risk index to really see how many children are currently affected by climate and environmental hazards, shocks and stresses, and then also provide a view of that risk from a child's perspective, and also ranking these places where children are most at risk. So we have basically two elements to it. One is the exposure to the climate and environmental hazards and shocks and stresses, but also to have actually the vulnerability of children mapped. And that's, of course, relevant for childcare, because that's one of these elements that maybe needs to be in place for social services on health, on education, and water and sanitation access. So childcare systems are equally important in determining the children's vulnerability. Now, if you go to the next slide, you can see that this index is combining the two. One is a set of parameters that's being collected on the exposure, and that's on the left hand in red, and the other side is in blue on the child's vulnerability. And the more information we have about children and how they actually are indeed becoming resilient, the more we can actually understand what to do and what to support in terms of adaptation. So we did this for 57 variables. So you can see a highlight of these groups of variables, but we did it also across the majority of countries in the world. What we're going to do at UNICEF now is to look at subnational kind of indices that look at maybe at province level and at ward level to see where childcare services or social services need to be actually emphasized and supported with adaptation measures going forward. If you go to the next slide, you can see some of the maps, I believe, where these two, kind of the hazards on the left side and the vulnerability on the right side have been mapped out globally. And if you go to the next slide, you will see the combination of those two. And what is indeed striking here, that indeed the southern and eastern Africa region are very darkly colored and actually are indeed one of the countries with the highest risks. You can see the southern Africa region in the top south is maybe less exposed. It's of course also less densely populated, and higher populations do exist in the eastern part as compared with the southern Africa part. So that's one of the reasons that this climate risk index is showing a little bit of a difference between Eastern Africa and Southern Africa. If you go to the next slide, you can see some of the countries that are in the top 50. And I highlighted the ones that actually in the Southern and Eastern Africa region, I highlighted them in red. And you can see that there's a large number, I believe 12 out of 51, that is actually at very high or high risk. So you can see actually these environmental factors and climate factors in orange, the scoring on the vulnerability in blue, and the combined scoring in purple. So that's basically the list of countries where we maybe have to pay attention to children's rights, not only for water sanitation and high health and education, but also for childcare systems. So I think that's the end of the presentation. I'd be happy to answer any questions. And there are many, many more slides and information packages available. They're also online, so we can make that available for people that have interest to delve more deeper into this. Thank you very much. I hope it was clear.
Thank you, Mark. That was so helpful and has given us such useful background. It's very terrifying, but also very, very helpful. So thanks very much for that. So Mark, I think, gave a really good overview of some of the impacts of climate change on communities and also around children's rights. And I'm going to talk now more specifically around the impacts on children's care. So I'll just share my screen so I can get my presentation up. Sorry, just give me 1 second. Okay. So I'm going to start off just by talking about the impact of climate change on some of the drivers of inadequate care. And I'm going to talk about 6 of the most common reasons why children become separated from their parents or why violence in families increases. And I'll go through each of those in turn and talk about how climate change has affected them. I think this is repeating some of what Mark said, just to reiterate it. So first of all, we know that poverty often leads to children being placed in residential care or being sent to live with relatives. And it can also increase violence within families with the stress related to poverty. And we're already seeing impacts of poverty increasing as a result of climate change, some of which Mark has described. It's estimated that climate change is going to push nearly 40 million people into poverty in sub-Saharan Africa. And we're likely to see particular impacts on already vulnerable groups. So I'm sure you're all aware, but most of the children outside of parental care in the region are cared for by elderly grandparents. And this group is likely to be particularly affected by climate change related increases in poverty. Education is also a major reason why children become separated from their parents. They're sent to live with relatives, to go to schools, or placed into institutional care to go to school. And climate change is affecting education in multiple ways. As Mark mentioned in his presentation, it's having an impact on school infrastructure. Children may be unable to study or concentrate in school during intense heat waves, and we're also seeing families who like to be too poor to send their children to school. And we're already seeing some impacts of climate change on children's education in the region. So, for example, the ongoing drought in the Horn of Africa is leading to 3.3 million children being at risk of school dropouts, and we think that girls' education is especially likely to be affected. So mental health and stress is another reason why children become separated from parents, or why there's violence in homes. Caregiver mental health and stress can increase violence against children in the home, or parents can just be too kind of overwhelmed to care for children. And children's stress can also lead to challenging behaviours, which can lead to separation or violence against children as parents try to deal with those behaviours. And there's a lot of research suggesting that both child and adults' well-being, emotional well-being, is affected by climate change, as children and adults are becoming increasingly anxious about climate change, but also just stressed by the new frequency of disasters, floods and droughts and cyclones affecting their lives. There's some very interesting research with adolescents affected by Cyclone Idai, for example. And these young people really felt out of control of their lives. They felt stressed, not being able to be in their own homes, having to rely on people outside of their family, strangers often, to look after them and put them up. And also they were picking up a lot on the distress of their parents, and they were very anxious about that as well. So then going on to migration and displacement, which can also increase risk of family separation. It's estimated that by 2030, there will be 86 million climate change migrants in sub-Saharan Africa. And climate change can lead to both planned and unplanned family separations, and increased risk of violence as a result of migration and displacement. So we're seeing, for example, both slow onset and sudden onset climate change related emergencies that are leading to this type of displacement and family separation. So, for example, we might have children being separated in the chaos surrounding a flood. We also know that climate change can increase the risk of conflict, as people are fighting over increasingly shortages of resources such as water or fertile land. And obviously that can also lead to sudden separations. But children can also get separated in longer, slower onset emergencies such as droughts, as part of a kind of livelihood or survival strategy. So being sent away to work or sent to live with richer relatives living in perhaps more secure locations. Some children are obviously moving with their parents, but these children may also be at higher risk of separation, as many of the drivers of separation that we've already talked about, such as poverty or lack of access to education, tend to be worse in those families. So as Mark mentioned, climate change is going to lead to increased risk of death, perhaps as a result of people being killed during disasters, but also the spread of deadly diseases such as malaria, which will lead to more parental and caregiver deaths. And again, elderly caregivers who are often responsible for looking after children who can't be cared for by their parents are likely to be especially vulnerable here. And finally, there is a correlation between violence against women and violence against children. So children in homes where there's domestic violence are more likely to experience violence themselves either at the hands of men who are violent against both women or children, or women in some cases taking out their frustration about being abused against their children. And there are many ways in which violence against women are being increased by climate change. We're seeing quite a lot of evidence about this. So perhaps men taking out their fear and their frustration about repeated crop failures on women, or experiencing a crisis of masculinity because they can't provide for their families. And also during difficult times, it's very hard for women to take their children away from these violent situations because they can't afford to do this. They're too financially vulnerable. And we're already seeing evidence and examples of this. For example, the drought in the Horn of Africa, there's evidence to suggest that that's leading to increased violence against women. Okay, so we've talked about how climate change can impact on the drivers of inadequate care and family separation. And this slide is really showing how that is actually manifesting itself into separations and violence against children. So, for example, after cyclone Idai, even a few months after, 400 children in Mozambique still continue to be remained separated from their parents. A recent survey has been done in Somalia around the drought, and of those surveyed, family separation was highlighted as kind of a key risk of the drought, and 16% of those surveyed thought that that was likely to increase because of the drought. And in Ethiopia, there's conflict which has been partly attributed to climate change, which has already separated 9,000 children from their parents. So we're seeing climate change is not something that's coming to us in the future, but it's already affecting children's care. We're also seeing that services and support for children's care are not matching the needs that are being generated by climate change. So already overstretched child protection services can't respond to these increases in violence and risks against family separation. And also it's likely that as governments are constantly firefighting with new disasters coming in all of the time, it's going to be difficult for them to invest in long-term planning and resources around children's care and protection, which is often the last area to be financed in any case. So some examples of this: after Idai, agencies were very overwhelmed with the number of child protection cases and really struggled to respond to all of those. And in Ethiopia, where climate change is contributing to conflict, there are 846,000 children in camps for the internally displaced, and there's very little access to child protection services in many of those camps. So I'm just going to talk through now how we can think about mitigating the negative impacts of climate change on children's care. And first of all, to talk about some of the principles within this. So first of all, the real importance of continuing to promote the primacy of family-based care and ensuring that in the chaos around climate change and some of the risks and increased exposure to separation because of climate change, we're not forgetting this principle, and we're continuing to make maximum efforts to ensure that children can stay within families during emergencies and after emergencies. So when we're responding to climate change related disasters, we need to make sure that there are family-based alternative care options, but we do need to try and avoid things like adoption during emergency periods, just to wait until things are calm enough so that we can really assess children and families and make sure there really is no possibility of children going back to their families. And I think probably most importantly, we've seen from previous crises affecting the Eastern and Southern Africa regions, such as the HIV pandemic, that kinship care, that's care by friends of the family and extended family members, is the most widely used response to protect vulnerable children who can't be cared for by their parents. So we really need to make sure that those caregivers, which as I mentioned are often elderly grandparent caregivers who are becoming more and more vulnerable with climate change, that they're being protected and supported so that they can carry on looking after children who can't be looked after by their parents. We need to use principles of good practice that we already know about for emergency responses. These are going to become even more important as we're seeing more and more emergencies as a result of climate change. So, for example, balancing investments in preparation and response. I know UNICEF has a very strong emphasis on building resilience within families and communities, and also trying to use emergency responses to build back care systems better. So really using it as an opportunity to try and improve care systems, and avoiding creating a parallel care system within the emergency response to the national care system. So, for example, thinking about how responses to care in climate change related emergencies reflect national standards, and can also how those responses can be used to try and improve national care systems and strengthen those systems. And finally, the importance of promoting child and community engagement. So child participation is always really important, as we know, but I think it becomes even more important in the context of climate change, because children's lives are really changing very rapidly, and they need to build up some of the skills and the resilience to be able to respond to that rapid change. And we also need to be able to listen to them, to be able to understand what's happening in those lives in this context of rapid change. So that's really central. And community engagement also is essential, because most children who are abused within families or separated from parents have no contact with social services or NGOs. Usually those issues are dealt with within the family without that kind of formal engagement. So, and as those government services get put under increasing pressure because of climate change, it's likely that communities are going to play an even stronger role. So again, we need to really strengthen and build those community responses. So it's really important to map the impacts of climate change on the care system. And that's all aspects of what we refer to as the care system, which is everything that helps to improve children's care. So we're thinking about policies and legislation, workforce strengthening, the strategies that we have around care, social norms, the finances of care, all of those things to try and understand how climate change is impacting on those. And also looking at how climate change is affecting care and the drivers of care, and constantly assessing that and updating that so we can map risk in the ways that Mark has described in his presentation, but specifically around care, so we can see where risk is greatest. We also need to try and understand children and caregiver perspectives, as I've already mentioned, and understand how different groups of children and caregivers are affected, and try and identify particularly vulnerable groups. And really importantly, I think we need to understand and strengthen some of the existing coping strategies that are already being used to respond to climate change and improve children's care in those contexts. So climate change really must now be included in all care reform strategies and policies. So policies and strategies should respond to the current and likely future impacts of climate change, and explain how the care system will adapt in response to climate change, and ensure that care systems are built to meet care needs during this likely increase in the number of emergencies. So, for example, ensuring that systems can be alternative family-based care can be expanded if it needs to be rapidly, if there's an emergency that leads to increased rates of family separation. On the other side of the coin, we also need to make sure that those working on climate change and climate change adaptation strategies and disaster preparedness plans are thinking about care. So this would include national plans for adapting to climate change and disaster risk reduction strategies. And a little scan of these strategies suggests that, and the National Adaptation Plan suggests that they don't really have an emphasis on how governments will adapt in relation to care and protection. So that's something we can campaign for and work alongside colleagues working on those strategies to try and push for that to be included. So we need to really make sure that the social workforce is ready for climate change. The needs for social workers is likely to increase because of climate change. So we need to try and advocate and lobby now for increases in the size of that workforce, but also support social workers to respond to climate change. For example, making sure that they're aware of climate change and the likely impacts on the communities that they work with. And that they can get involved in monitoring the impacts of climate change, because they're working with these incredibly vulnerable communities and families all the time, so they can see in real time what's happening and report back on that. Climate change is going to lead to a lot of change and rapid changes within communities. So social workers need to have the confidence, the autonomy and the authority to adapt and adjust their practice to that rapid change. They might need additional resources and infrastructure to carry out their work during climate change related emergencies. So for example, vehicles that can navigate floods, or buildings that are more resistant to cyclones. And providing additional mental health support is likely to be necessary, because this is going to be a very stressful time for social workers. We should be including climate change in case management guidance and ensuring that there are really strong referral pathways so that social workers can refer families, for example, if they have increased exposure to poverty because of climate change, they can be referred to social protection services. We need to build climate change responsive care related services. So, for example, we need to increase services that respond to this increased risk of separation as a result of climate change. So we might need to expand social protection, build shock resistant schools, develop physical and mental health services, and ensure that humanitarian actors really know how to prevent separation. In some cases, separation happens because of the action of these humanitarian actors. For example, they might see a child that they think is separated and take them away, keep them from where they are without really having a good look around to check that if there are community members nearby who know who this child is and who their parents are, who might be able to step in and care for them temporarily. And we also, of course, need services for children who are already separated as a consequence of climate change. So, for example, stepping up efforts to reintegrate children with their families and building alternative care options, prioritising, of course, kinship care and support to that. We could think about many countries in the region are trying already to reduce the number of children in residential care, particularly in harmful large-scale institutions. And as part of this process, those facilities are being repurposed to provide different forms of support. So we could think about how that repurposing could be done to help respond to climate change. For example, could those facilities be a shelter that could be used during floods, or could they maybe be a feeding centre that's used during droughts or food shortages? So we can really build that into strategising about what to do with those facilities. So we need to ensure that children have the skills and the capacities to deal with the new adversity and change that's going to happen as a consequence of climate change. So children need greater resilience. They need the ability to adapt rapidly in the face of adversity. They need kind of the leadership skills and the social awareness to be able to hold their governments to account now and in the future. And also, it's great if children have a strong sense of community and shared responsibility for the well-being of societies. So caregivers have a really key role in ensuring that children can build up those skills. And they also have an important role to play in helping children deal with the climate change related anxiety. So we need to build these knowledge of climate change and the capacity of climate change, of building these skills that children need into the skills that caregivers have through, for example, considering how climate change can be addressed in parenting programs, and really importantly, making sure that kinship carers have access to those programs, and also in the training of other carers, such as foster carers or residential care home staff. And finally, we can contribute to campaigns to limit climate change. The first graph that Mark showed us was really demonstrating how we are still at a point where we can try and reduce global emissions, and that's going to diminish the negative effects of climate change. So we have a role to play in persuading governments to reduce their carbon emissions. And we, those of us working on care, can contribute by, for example, documenting and sharing evidence of the impacts of climate change and speaking with real authority about how the most vulnerable groups are being affected, raising awareness around climate change through our work, either with direct work with children and families or our work with governments or NGOs, and giving children and caregivers a voice. And I think it's sort of tempting to view climate change as something that needs to be dealt with by climate specialists, but it's having such a fundamental impact on care that those working on care, those of us who are working on this issue, really can't ignore it any longer. And we really need to start contributing to efforts to reduce and mitigate the negative impacts of climate change on children's care. Right. I'm going to stop there. And we're going to go now into an example of climate change and its impacts on children's care from Mozambique. And we're very happy to have Desi Cornelia Mahatas with us, who is the Chief of the Sofala Regional Office for UNICEF Mozambique. Thank you so much for joining us, Desi. And I'm just going to ask Desi a few questions about the impacts of Cyclone Idai and how that affected children's care. Just give me 1 second. Just need to do one small thing first. Great, Desi. So first of all, can you tell us a bit more about what happened during Cyclone Idai, how it happened and how many families and communities were affected by that cyclone, for those that may not be familiar with that event?
Good morning, and thank you very much for inviting us for this webinar. Of course, Mozambique have faced several cyclones and natural disasters along the years, and Idai was identified as one of the worst in the last 2 decades. And it happens. It's now about four years completed in March 14, when it landed near to Beira, and it was a storm that was having heavy winds and accompanied by heavy rains, and that suddenly affected a lot of people. And it was indicated that more than 1.8 million were affected by the cyclone Idai, affecting mainly 4 provinces. And immediately after the Idai, 6 weeks after, the country also have had another cyclone that affected the northern part of the country. So as you can see, such a strong and massive events have been affecting the country and causing a lot of massive destruction into the infrastructure, but also displacing a lot of people from their original areas of residence to others. And Idai have caused more than 130,000 people were displaced to other areas. As an example, one of the most affected area here in Sofala province, Buzi, most of them were displaced to Beira. since there were floodings and in the rescue process, they were taken to far away has beta. So that was the impact that we had. Crops were distracted, and so many infrastructures, schools, health facilities were also affected.
Thank you so much. And can you tell me, did some of those impacts that you've described, did that lead to children becoming separated from their parents as a consequence of Idai? And how were they separated? What happened to those children?
Of course, as I said, the displacement of population was massive. And the way the rescue was conducted, the rescue resulted in people going far away from their um, origin areas. And actually, initially, the process of rescuing children were given priority in the rescue process. And initially, as you can see, using this prioritization process resulted in that naturally separation from their families in the initial phase was observed massively, but also along the process of organizing people in the transit centers, and so people becoming reunited with their family, children becoming reunited with their families, and by the end of the process, we can see that yes, there were those who were separated, but at the end of the process, most of them get reunited in the process itself. So in general, thousands of them were really displaced with their families, and as a result, separated from them.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. And how about for those that were separated from their families, how easy was it to then reconnect them and reunite them? You mentioned that most of them were able to reconnect with their families. How easy was it to do that process, and what were some of the ways that you were able to do that?
Actually, family tracing and reunification during the impact of Idai was proven to be challenging. As I said, the first challenge we had um, um, also was the information, and I may say the accuracy of the information, because in some way there were misunderstanding of the information that we were getting. At the beginning, the crisis was a huge number of children were reported separated and even unaccompanied. But children were reported were later on emerged in most and being intentionally reunited with their families. Secondly, the misunderstanding that was observed, and I may say confusion in the concept of separation and accompanied children was new, and most of the organization were not, I may say, familiar of with the concept itself, and that also may have caused a kind of misdefining who the children that was separated or unaccompanied. In some cases, even orphans children were misunderstood as part of the unseparated children, and also the impact itself as a result of that, some of the parents were identified as dead, and for sure those children were becoming in such a situation. So those process of the to build on common understanding and concerted effort for family and reunification. A lot of efforts have been put into place. Training of humanitarian actors was conducted. For instance, UNICEF, IFRC were involved in such a process, and also other NGOs led training for humanitarian actors like social workers, so that they can conduct case management, tracing, and also a better understanding of those processes. Later on, also it was important the process of for better understanding of the impact and of the process. Joint missions were conducted. As I said initially, also the information at we needed to reassess the information to get the figures as much as possible to inform all the process. So in general, those were the action that have been taken just to make sure that all the actors were clear what mean and what to be done.
Fantastic. And was there any evidence of increases in violence within families as a consequence of Idai, perhaps immediately after the cyclone or in the months and years that followed?
Yes, for as I said initially, this Idai impact was massive and have caused a lot of destruction, and also worsening the condition in which people was already living, and poverty was already there, and this destruction was exacerbating this condition. In terms of also exacerbating the protection risks, including sexual and gender-based violence, were also part of the impact, since the condition within families were challenging. Also, in terms of other impacts, the loss of personal documentation related, also issues related to land and property rights were issues that also contributed also to increase the violence within the context of families. And as you can imagine, families have lost everything that they in their homes, their livelihoods, and even they have lost family members as a result of this cyclone. So in general, the cyclone, yes, have brought up issues and concerns regarding violence and in the families.
Thank you. We have a question from UNICEF Madagascar, which I'll just put to you because it was actually one of the questions I was going to ask you in any case, but it's really about the lessons that you've learned from Idai, and if there's any if you wanted to share with other countries that may be preparing for similar cyclones or responding to cyclones in the future, what messages would you like to give them in terms of how you prevent and respond to family separation or child protection issues in the face of such events?
Yes, it is critical, for instance, to set up systems to enable case management and also family tracing and reunification of unaccompanied or separated children. Um, uh, After a disaster, it is also critical that the deed are cataloged and managed in a dignified way, so that it's new, and also uh, issues related also to cultural aspect. It's important so that dignity also for that it's recognized. From other way, without proper management of human remains, bodies and go unidentified, and families are less likely to have closure of process of loss. So child protection actors also, it's another acknowledge that primary prevention it's in level of intervention prior to disaster. It is the most effective way to address or even prevent family separation before it occurs. So I may say the preparedness for such an event is critical and important for what if we are better prepared, we are able to address timely and successfully such issues. So also there is a need for guided and understanding of multiple causes of separation, so that protective factors that are present in the cultural context also can be addressed. It is also important to feed into the design and implementation of appropriate population level and multi-sectoral programs approach are also important to be addressed and looking for the child within their context of the family, community, and also observing and what are the cultural norms and such. Um, um, uh, Procedures also like primary prevention requires mobilization of concerned actors. So that is also critical to involve all at national, but also the others that international and also community-based in across the humanitarian sectors, and all relevant levels that are across. So primary prevention intervention may include uh, uh, targeting highly vulnerable population in key geographic locations. Also measuring with the affected population, like prevention of family separation, uh, producing message and information which is practical for guidance. We can use radio, TV, social media, or even printed materials to take the message to community. Also, it is important to raise the awareness about on family separation and the risk that that can that can involve, and also address critical solutions in that process, such as the evacuations, transportation, also issues regarding the management of the camps and the distribution, and so those are issues that I think were part of the lesson that we did learn along this process. Uh, um, Also, we need to pay attention that some sensitivity to protection concerns, particularly for girls and women, including GBV, that are issues that we need also to pay attention in the process of the response. And other issue, as I mentioned before, during this process, some of them, they lose everything. So we need also to, as part of long-term interventions, promote registration, also social protection system that are in place to be relevant at in the country and being addressed accordingly. So those are part of the interventions and lessons that we had. As you may imagine, the complexity of the situation, and also the response, calling for all actors to be in the right direction. So we needed to have systematically information and clear information, and also the coordination aspects also to be taken into account.
Thank you. I think you raise a couple of really interesting points that we're always trying to push when we're talking about care reform, around the importance of collaborating with other actors outside of the care and protection sector, and also this issue of kind of building resilience to future emergencies has also come out as really important. Does anyone else have any additional questions? We've already responded to the one that from UNICEF in Madagascar. Are there any other questions? I'm just checking. I don't think I've missed anything. You can raise your hand, or you can just type a question in the chat box if you have anything else you'd like to ask either Mark, Desi, or myself. Please go ahead. Maybe while you're thinking of your questions, I just have one more question for you, Desi. Do you think that Cyclone Idai has changed some of the work that UNICEF's doing, or some of the responses that the government has to vulnerability in communities? Has it kind of left a legacy in children's protection and care in any way?
Yes, that's a critical question, and I think yes, for us, this was, I may say, a learning process has at the end of this process, due to the complexity, and also the availability of actors and resources in place. In terms of responding to the process, UNICEF has part of the responsibility was really prioritizing to address all the protection aspects related to the child, and also to make sure the services were provided timely to the child. So those were part that I may say it was complex and challenging, but we pushed to ensure that the case management was provided, and also tracking all the cases, and also making sure that all the actors were in place to respond to the needs in a comprehensive way. So also we need to care, but we're also looking for the other needs that the children in general have needs. So the provision of services needs also this to take into account that.
Wonderful, thank you. And I just wanted to flag that Carolina, who's also in the UNICEF office, has just put something in the chat box around the importance also of really early identification of the children at risk of separation, as well as being a kind of key factor in meeting the needs of those children. I know UNICEF in Mozambique have done some really interesting work around social protection and integrating social protection with other aspects of child protection, with the kind of cash plus models, providing other forms of support. So as part of the learning platform, we did do a paper about a year ago now on social protection and care linkages, where we give that case study. So hopefully Bertha's going to post in a minute some links to our website, and those that are interested can take a look at that paper there. Great. Unless there are any other questions, I will just okay, I'm just seeing there's one here. So this is from Guy, who is in Thailand, working in Southeast Asia. And he says, I am based in Southeast Asia, and kinship care is usually the responsibility of elder grandparents. I'm glad we talked about this in the presentation. I wonder if agencies working on child protection are systematically creating alliances with organisations working with elder people, such as HelpAge, which is I think a British-based NGO, but that work all over the world with elderly people. And similarly, if community leaders responsible for supporting kinship care are often older people, and perhaps this would be a good way of creating a more holistic network around children's care to kind of link up with some of those people working with elderly people as well. Do you in UNICEF in Mozambique, do you work with any organisations working with older people alongside your work with children? Is that question clear? Sorry, probably not. Just wondering if you do any work with some of those elderly and vulnerable caregivers, and if you work with others that are working with those groups. Oh, Desi, I think we might have lost the connection to you. Your microphone's gone again. Sorry. We were having some problems at the beginning, and now we can't hear you again, Desi. Sorry. Not to worry. I think we probably need to wrap up round about now in any case. That's a really good question. And I know that I've previously tried to create some of those linkages and work around kinship care. And I think that's a very good idea to kind of connect with some of those organisations working with elderly populations, as it's in the interests of those working to protect children, to ensure that those older people are also being well looked after and cared for, so that they can better support vulnerable children. Mona, I'm going to hand back over to you now to just wrap up at the end of that presentation, and to tell us a bit more about some of the other activities within the platform that we have planned and ongoing at the moment.
Sure, thank you. Thank you very much, Emily, for first of all, the preparation of this learning session, and also the facilitation of the presentation that you did based on the research and studies that you have done in our region, and thanking Bertha also for ensuring that we have a very smooth and information shared in the chat box. I'd also like to thank my colleagues Mark and Desi for very insightful presentations, right? I personally have learned a lot, in terms of climate change and its impacts on childcare reform and also vulnerabilities that children face. We've heard from extreme weather events, climate change has great potential in affecting the quality of care that children are getting, heat waves, air quality, the fact of displacement and even food insecurities all play a very huge impact on the care of children. So overall, for my key takeaway is that it's important for us as childcare reform practitioners, alongside with our respective policymakers, to take the steps required to address the potential impacts of climate change and childcare in order to ensure that children are able to access safe and reliable care, regardless of the challenges posed by climate change. And this is our current reality. We're living in times of the climate crisis and really need to be prepared and ensure our programs are resilient and we're well prepared to deliver services for the care of children in times of this crisis. So with that, let me share with you a few announcements from the learning platform. First of all, I'll ask Bertha, if you haven't done so already, to share with us a short poll. I would like all the participants to complete this short poll of this meeting. We'd like to know where you're connecting from. So you can see the questions there. Who do you work for? And select one of those, and then tell us where do you work, like where are you connecting from, which part of the region or the world you're connecting with us this morning. So please be doing that. Just take a minute to respond to this question, please, and submit your responses so that we can get an overview of where everybody is connecting from and from the 29 participants. Okay. I'll give it another minute before we can share the findings of where everybody is connecting from. And maybe as that is ongoing, let me finish with the rest of the announcements. That's okay. So there we are. As it has been mentioned earlier, we have several new resources to share from the platform. There's a new paper on kafala, a new video on kinship care, and some case studies on multiple aspects of care reform. So all these links to these, new resources are available in the chat box. So please make sure you take advantage and click those links and learn from what is happening around the region. With regards to the next webinar, the next webinar from the learning platform on care will be taking place in late April and will be on transformation of residential care facilities to offer other forms of support. So the webinar is going to be on the transformation of residential care facilities to offer other forms of support. We plan to have a global expert giving an overview of the key components of successful transformation, and then we'll have panelists from several of the key components of successful transformation. And the panelists will give us, will be from several residential care facilities, and they'll talk about experiences of transformation. We also present a research that was carried out by some of our partners, Changing the Way We Care, on the factors that persuade providers to transform. So that's another very interesting webinar, encouraging you all and your government partners and CSO partners working in care to tune in. And of course, we will share updates through the newsletter and also updates through if you have registered in the mailing list. Just as a reminder, to get details of this and future webinars, please join our mailing list by completing a short form. Again, there is a link, there should be a link in the chat box that you can click and subscribe to this mailing list and get latest updates from the platform. And also links have also been shared by Bertha of other publications on the websites for the platform. And we have several, as I mentioned earlier, new publications that are available. So do take advantage and do disseminate these the documentations that are being produced from the platform with your partners working on care. So let me stop there. Bertha or Emily, and let's see if we can see the poll results, and then we can conclude and wrap up. So, okay, we see the majority of the participants are from UNICEF offices. That's interesting, followed by consultancy firms and a tie between universities and NGOs. That's interesting. I'll go through the chat box to see which universities have connected with us today. That will be interesting to know. And in terms of the geographical coverage, the region that we're seeing that has the highest number of participants is, again, of course, the East and Southern Africa region. We are also having a tie between elsewhere in Africa and elsewhere in the world. So this is promising. And we really look forward to having more participants joining us, and we'll ensure to share the information widely with the other regional offices as well. So with that, I thank you all very much for your active participation. And once again to the presenters, Desi and Mark, for the insights you've shared with us this morning, and really looking forward to continuing this dialogue and to really supporting our country offices in building our programs to be resilient to address great and appropriate care for children in times of the climate crisis. With that, I thank you all very much. Have a good rest of the day. Goodbye.
Thank you.